with the paranormal stuff too, it sounds like the universe, you put it out there in the universe and the universe is responding. Is that kind of how it's going for that kind of thing?
Yeah, because I took a chance by doing this, and it was 2 years ago that a dear friend of mine passed away. He's Norwegian American like myself. We grew up together. And I had a very intense experience after he died. About a month after he died, he came to visit me in a semi-dream state. And I talked to him, and he encouraged me to write the book. He said, I know you've had these experiences, and here you are, we're talking. And we had this conversation, and him being in the spirit world and me where we are. And he taught me a lot of stuff, and he even gave me the title for the book, Timeless. And he told me what it was like in the afterlife, and which I'd always suspected, but I wasn't quite sure. And then it came flooding back to me, all these things that had happened. And so I wrote it very quickly. It just came out very quickly, because some of the stuff I had collected already in written form, and others I still had fresh in my memory. And I put it all together, organized it chronologically, because I'm a historian, so you have to have chronology. And he was instrumental. His name is Gene, and he's in fact, it was his birthday yesterday. I think it was his birthday yesterday.
Birthday Gene.
What's that?
It said happy birthday, Gene.
Yeah, happy birthday, Gene. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and he was a big celebratory guy. He was an actor too, interesting, very good actor. So in Seattle, up in Seattle, did a lot of commercials and short films and stuff. But so that was 2 years ago, and that's what made me take that kind of paranormal turn in my writing. But now I really love it, and maybe it'll be more than 3 books. But right now, for sure, I know it's a trilogy. So maybe it'll add to that, or I'll go in a different direction. Who knows? That's the fun of writing. You got to go where the spirit takes you.
So, Bruce, tell us, where did you grow up?
Well, I grew up in Seattle. I always say Seattle, but actually it was Kenmore, Washington, but it was unincorporated, but our address was Seattle. But I was born in a hospital in Seattle at Northgate Hospital, which is actually part of a shopping mall, or at least it was. So I was born in a shopping mall. It was actually part of the mall. There was a movie theater on one end, and then a hospital kind of in the middle, and then the mall, and it was all connected together. So my mom was quite a multitasker. She went shopping, went to a movie, and then had a baby. So.
Do you know what movie she saw?
I don't know, but it was 1958, so I bet it was an Elvis movie.
Oh, yeah, there you go. What did your parents do for a living?
Well, they were both immigrants. They came to the United States in 1948, and my mom worked as a maid, and she worked in a factory for a while my dad was fishing in Alaska. And when he wasn't fishing, he was a carpenter. So they were both hardworking, blue collar, union type people. And by the time I was born, my mom had become a homemaker. So my dad had built up his reputation as a carpenter, and he didn't have to fish much anymore. So really, my mom was a stay-at-home mom and a homemaker, and so I had kind of a Leave It to Beaver childhood in many ways.
Did they either of them have any artistic tendencies, or were you kind of just different from that?
My mom was an artist. She was she painted in oils, and I have a couple of her paintings in our hallway here. So she was quite a pretty talented painter and a very artistic type person, and a free thinker. And my dad was the practical work, the blue collar worker. Very both of them only had sixth grade educations because that's all that was required in Norway and where they grew up in northern Norway. But they were quite intelligent, both of them in their own way. My dad in a very practical way, and my mom in a very she was a very artistic person, and she was a feminist, for instance, which is kind of interesting for a lady of her age and being an immigrant lady. I just remember that growing up, that she was a feminist, which I didn't really understand at the time, but later I came to appreciate that.
That's interesting. Was it just because of her European background, or is it something that she inherited in America?
No, I think the way she grew up was very traditional, and there was a conflict actually with my mom and my dad. My dad, when he came home from work, a hard day of construction, he expected dinner on the table and the house to be cleaned, which it always was. But when I was about 9 or 10, I think my mom told my dad that she was going to take an oil painting class, and she was already painting in oils anyway. But there was a local artist who was offering a class at a community college, and she wanted to take that class, and they had a big argument over it. And I remember my dad saying that no wife of mine is going to go out at night and do such a thing. And my mom, of course, won the argument. She won every argument. I'm not sure why my dad ever even tried, but they loved each other. They were married over 50 years, and he had to adapt. I noticed later that my mom was reading a book, and it was on her bookshelf by her bed. And it was the feminine, I think it was the feminine Mystique. And she read that book, and of course that was a big liberating book for many women. I think it came out in 1963 when it first came out, and my mom read it, and I think it inspired her to start challenging my dad's total authority. And of course my dad, being a smart man, compromised with my mom because he knew how lucky he was to have my mom. So it worked out good for both of them, and they were married for 50 years. So that was a wonderful thing. But yeah, she was very artistic. Thought she was a very different kind of thinker than my dad, who was more practical. And she was also psychic. So that's where I got that from as well.
Who would you say was your biggest influence in your life then that helped you realize your writer's journey?
Well, I think it's both of them. From the artistic side, thinking in that way, it was from my mom. But then from the storytelling side, my father, even though he's very practical, he had a great sense of humor. He's great at telling jokes, and he was a very good storyteller. And he would tell tall tales, that kind of storyteller, which you always have to figure out, I wonder if that really happened or not. But it didn't really matter because it reminds me of that movie, what is it, Big Fish?
Uh-huh. Yeah,
it kind of reminded me of that. There was elements of truth to it, but there was also probably a punchline and some other things in there. But it always had kind of a moral to the story. And I enjoyed my dad's stories. And when he was, before he came to this country, he was a sailor. So he had sailed all around the world. He'd been to Antarctica.
Wow.
So I really connected with that movie, the Big Fish, because he really had a lot of adventures and met a lot of interesting people. So was that? I think it was that combination, practical type storyteller with the artistic mind of my mother that kind of, I kind of got a little bit of both.
Were you kind of like the son in that movie? Were you kind of like beholden to these stories? Were you kind of sick of them? Were you somebody who was like, "Oh, come on, Dad," or did you and appreciated them later in life, or were you somebody who actually enjoyed them?
I think I did appreciate them when I was younger, and then as a teen, I kind of rebelled a little bit, and then later in my late 20s, when I had a family and children, then I came to really appreciate them more and more, and every year since then. I'm now 60 years old, so and they both passed away. Let's see, my mom in 1990 and my dad in 1999. So, but a day doesn't go by where I don't remember, the things that they taught me and the skills that they gave me and the wonderful middle class life, comfortable, safe life that I had that nurtured me. So.
That being said, what age do you think you really got started storytelling and writing?
It was pretty early. I remember probably I was also pretty artistic myself. I would draw, I would paint. So I was making my own little books probably when I was 8 years old or so, 9. I remember making books and telling my parents that I was going to write books and paint and be an artist. And of course, I also wanted to be a baseball player and an astronaut and everything else, just like most kids. But I think I started writing very early, and then also I started using a typewriter, which I think is important at a very young age, probably around 9 or 10. I started typing things from my dad. He was, a carpenter, and he would have to sometimes get into scrapes with local building departments, and he'd have to write letters. Well, he didn't write English. He could speak English, and he could read English, but he wasn't very good at writing. So he would have me write and type these kind of business style letters. So I think that really helped me getting familiar with the keyboard at a very young age. And then they required me to take a typing class in junior high and again in high school. And I think they knew, because by that time I was writing a lot of poetry and short stories and stuff. And so they knew that was going to be something that would be very important for me.
You mentioned that you were into, other things like baseball and astronaut. Did you actually ever seriously think about running a different path, walking a different path than you are now? Or was it always this passion screaming out at you?
Well, the writing thing was always there. Even I thought I wanted to be an engineer for a while. So after I'd served my first 3 years in the Army, which was kind of a rebellion against my parents because I had dropped out of college and didn't really know what I wanted to do in college. And writing was always there. I was always writing, but I didn't figure I could make a living at it. So I eventually dropped out after I was at the University of Washington. I dropped out 1978. And then I joined the Army, did 3 years in the Army in Germany as a jail guard, which was an eye-opening experience.
I bet.
And had a family, had 2 kids when I came back in my early 20s. And then I went to engineering school, and I did okay in the writing part of it, like the tech writing class I took. But I spent most of my time drawing a comic book or a cartoon strip for the Montana Tech newspaper. And so I just started doing that, writing stories and illustrating that. And of course, then I dropped out and had to join the reserves again, and then decided I couldn't make it as a civilian, so I had to go back in the Army. And I decided to go to flight school. So I took a lot of turns, here and there. And I flew helicopters for a while. And then I got out in 1986 and went to work at Boeing. And I worked as a contract administrator in the military part of Boeing and then the commercial part of Boeing. But this whole time I was taking classes, going to school, getting my bachelor's degree, getting my master's degree eventually, and I was writing the whole time. I just kept writing. That's one constant through all these different career changes. The writing was always there. That never went away. It was just nagging at me the whole time. No matter what I did, I would daydream. I would write stories. And I remember working in the prison. I liked working night shift, the midnight shift, because I could write. all the prisoners were sleeping, so it was a great time to write. And from the classes I took while I was in the Army, I had a couple of mentors, and one in particular, Dr. Sidney T. Matthews. He had served as a military historian in World War II, and he had interviewed Patton and General Clark and General Montgomery and all these people. And he was one of the historians who wrote the history of the Italian campaign for the U.S. Army. And he was a mentor of mine, and I just thought I'd really love to do that. I like that academic kind of. It seemed kind of laid back and storytelling kind of stuff, and then you can also write. And I thought, wow, what a great combination. So I kind of set my sights on wanting to do that, and that's how I ended up eventually in a PhD program and getting my history, my history PhD.
Would you say that's when it turned for you? That's when it became serious that you were going to be a writer?
Yes, that I was actually going to produce things that people would read,
Right.
rather than just for my own amusement or the amusement of my friends, which is basically what it was. And that's fun too, to write with your friends and share stories. But I published my dissertation, which became my first book. And so I did a lot of serious academic writing. But at the same time, I kept writing poetry, songs, short stories. And, as an academic, I didn't have to produce this because I work at a community college, so they don't have the publish or perish type thing that they have at universities. But still, I wanted to publish academic stuff, and so I kept doing that. But I needed that creative outlet, so some other professors and I formed a band. We wrote songs, we performed those songs, and it's just another way of writing, just a different type of writing. And then eventually, in 2012, I decided to start writing plays, and so there was the non-academic writing. But it had always been there, this passion for writing. And just now I'd figured out, well, I'd rather be writing plays and other types of books rather than historical narratives and so forth. So I was able to write my first play, and it was produced, and it won some awards at the the Kennedy Center American College Theater Festival, and I've written 9 other plays since then. Another one has been produced in LA and also in Norway. So it's really come together quite well. All this preparation, I think all the technical writing, business writing, the historical writing that I did prepared me for where I am today as a playwright. And I wrote a fiction book for children called Ali's Bees, and now I'm writing this trilogy of paranormal books, which are nonfiction, and it's just a blast. I'm having a lot of fun with it.
I'd like to thank Joe Compton for letting me talk about my book here today. I'm going to read a story called Deception Pass. Now, these are all part of things that have actually happened to me. So this is a paranormal memoir. Another one of my earliest memories was of an incident that happened in 1965 on a family camping trip to a place called Deception Pass State Park in Washington State, when I was nearly 7 years old. There are 2 ways to get to Deception Pass. One way is to take the ferry to the south end of Whidbey Island and then drive to the north end to arrive at Deception Pass. The other way was to drive up Interstate 5 to Burlington and then go west towards Anacortes and drive onto Whidbey Island via 2 bridges from Fidalgo Island to Pass Island, which is in the middle, and then finally to Whidbey Island. The 2 bridge spans aren't very long. One is 500 feet, the other is 1,000 feet. The drop to the dangerous waters below is nearly 200 feet. The waters at Deception Pass at tide change are so turbulent because it is a narrow, deep channel that connects the Strait of Juan de Fuca with the Saratoga Passage. More than 500 people have committed suicide at Deception Pass since the 1930s by jumping off the bridge spans. Maybe that's why the bridge always gave me a rather eerie feeling. We would stop at Pass Island, where there would be a small parking lot, and we would get out and look around and marvel at the great height and rugged beauty of this unique Pacific Northwest location. There were plenty of trails on Pass Island, and none of them were supervised or had any protective safety fencing or guardrails in 1965. It was very treacherous, with a lot of sharp rocks below the steep high cliffs on the north side of Pass Island, called Canoe Pass. One summer day, I remember running around like crazy, like I usually did when I was a kid, with my parents not knowing where I was half the time. As I was running with careless abandon down a trail on the north side of Pass Island, I didn't notice that the path ended abruptly at the edge of the cliff. The cliff plunged down nearly vertical with sharp rocks at the bottom, 200 feet below, in the raging, turbulent seawater running through the narrow channel. I have two memories of what happened next. In one memory, I plunged to my certain death alone and immediately knew what a terrible mistake I had made. Oddly, I don't remember hitting the rocks below or the blackness, just blackness. In another memory, I ran off the cliff and again knew I was doomed, but then time stood still as I floated in the air momentarily. I felt an intense warmth and bright light hovering near me and holding me. The next thing I knew, I was back on the trail as if nothing had happened. My dad had me by the shoulders. He was furious and yelling at me. My mom came after and was crying. Had I fallen from the cliff and died, or had some mysterious force or entity stopped the tragedy and safely lifted me back onto the trail? Obviously, I'm writing these words, so I must have lived, yet I have this haunting feeling that something else happened as well. My parents were very angry and never spoke about this incident. I was convinced that this was the work of my guardian angel once again. I've thought about this near-death experience over the years and wonder if sometimes different paths in our lives run simultaneously. In other words, maybe there is one version where I died and another version where I lived. Maybe these forks in the road of time happen every once in a while, and therefore we never really die. We just continue living on another path ad infinitum. Eventually, after many such experiences and forks, we finally reach old age and die, but only temporarily. Maybe then we return anew to start a new life, reincarnated. It's just a theory. I have no proof, just a hunch. Perhaps there is no death, and perhaps death is the greatest deception of all.
What do you love about the playwriting aspect of it, of your skill set that you can't get from novel writing or writing even nonfiction?
Yeah, the thing about playwriting is that, well, fiction and historical narratives and so forth is a very insular type thing. You're very much in your own head, in your own world. You're very isolated. It can be very lonely sometimes. And I like people. I like being around people. I mean, I like my private time too, but theater is very community oriented. I mean, you write the play, which is basically kind of an outline until you start getting actors together and reading it and seeing what lines sound ridiculous and what settings sound ridiculous and what can and can't be done on stage. And
precisely. Besides, Wild Bill is due to arrive in town any time now, according to Marthy. He will back you up should you lose your nerve, dear boy.
I never had any nerve to lose.
Martha Jane helps Sam strap on the guns. Ezekiel whispers some final instructions to Martha Jane.
it's a very communal type thing, and you really have to work with people. And I loved it. I caught the theater bug, and I just loved working with actors and directors and producers, and everybody contributes, the lighting people, the sound people, everybody has their own. It's like all these artists painting this painting together, different aspects of it. You know, it's pretty intense, you know, because once you get together, it's like reminds me of being in the Army, how you need each other so much to produce a play, as opposed to a novel or you know, writing my nonfiction, which is a very isolated, solitary type activity.
Is there one that you prefer over the other, or they both equally give you something differently?
I like all of them, so I like to switch back and forth. So I'm not saying that I'll never write another historical book narrative, but I might. But right now, I'm working on this nonfiction trilogy of all my paranormal experiences, and I've gone down that route. As I like to say, I've come out of the paranormal closet, and have now been exposing myself. These things that I've had since I was a kid too. Not only did I have this thing that I wanted to write, this passion for writing, but also I've had these paranormal experiences that relates to my mother being, psychic and all that. Mm-hmm. And so now I've collected all those stories, and some I've written down, some I haven't. And I've shared them in my first Timeless book, Timeless, of Paranormal Personal History. And that was 34 stories. And now I've written another book called Timeless Deja Vu with 29 more stories. And that'll come out in April. And then the third book in the trilogy, Timeless Trinity, will come out next year. Mm-hmm. And there's probably going to be at least 25 or so stories in there because things keep happening. And I've kind of cultivated it. Before paranormal stuff would just happen frequently but randomly, but now I've learned a few things, and I have learned about mediumship and all this kind of stuff, and it's all fascinating. I even teach a class at Citrus College and that I call Paranormal Personal History, which is a really fun class to teach. So it's just, I think everything I've done up to this point has prepared me for what I'm doing right now. But I love it all. I love writing songs. I love writing poetry. I like playing music. I like all of it. It's all a way to express what's in my soul, I think. In this case, literally.
And part of your book, you go back in your childhood, especially the first one, you go back in your childhood a little bit and yes. recount some things that maybe you didn't recognize as paranormal at the time, but kind of led you on this journey, right?
Yeah, I did. I went all the way back to age 4 and realized that that's really my first paranormal experience, the angelic experience up in northern Norway, where I believe I almost died. And I'm not sure exactly what it was. I had a medical person, a nurse, tell me that based on my description, she thought it might have been meningitis, which is a very serious illness, especially in northern Norway, where there's no hospitals on this remote island where I was when I was 4 years old. And I had an angelic experience that my mother, it was a miraculous cure overnight because I was very sick, almost paralyzed. And they weren't sure if it was polio or if it was something else. But the next morning I was cured, and I had this vision of an angel taking care of me. And my mom said that was my guardian angel. And from that point forward, I think that kind of opened a door for me. And then I started having these experiences. And I guess when I was a kid, I thought everybody did. Mm-hmm. I thought it was just, well, to me, I do believe the paranormal really is normal. Yeah. But for me, it really was. And most kids, they have, make-believe playmates and they talk to people and stuff. And then you're supposed to grow out of that. Well, I never quite grew out of it. So I never stopped believing because I kept experiencing. But I didn't really talk about it because when I got the job here at the college, if I was to, they would say, okay, well, you have these credentials. What else? What other special skills do you have? If I would have said, well, I can talk to the dead too, I wouldn't have gotten the job. They would have thought I was nuts, right? So, but when you've been here 20 years, they just think you're just eccentric, right? Instead of nuts. When you get older, you're eccentric. When you're younger, you're nuts, right?
And they get to know you and they realize that's probably more true than it isn't.
These kind of paranormal abilities, I think it's like throwing a ball. Everybody can throw a ball, but only a few people can throw it 90 miles an hour, Yeah. Like I use baseball analogies a lot. So I think that's what it is, but everybody has it. Some people have it and they're afraid of it because they think maybe it's bad or it has some evil connotations, which can cause them not to want to exercise it or talk or even talk about it. But in fact, since I came out of the paranormal closet, a lot of my colleagues and others have come up to me and said, man, I got a story to tell you. And they want validation, and they figure like, well, if he can talk about it, I guess I can talk to him about it, which is good. I think that's a good thing. And the reactions have been very good by my colleagues, by the college. I mean, the fact that the college lets me teach the class, that kind of speaks volumes. And here I was afraid that I would be put out to pasture early for being a little bit too eccentric, you know.
Are you careful when you're writing these things to not mystify it, not too outlandish, but keep it kind of focused so that normal people, or no, I shouldn't say normal people, that's the wrong one.
No, I like that. That's good. That's fine.
but so that people who aren't so indoctrinated with it can kind of get something from it.
I know what you're saying. You got to be careful, you know. Well, I'll put it this way. This is really interesting. My Ginger, my wife, she's very much a skeptic, which I think is very healthy because that keeps me grounded. Because if I'm just surrounded by mediums and mystics and psychics all the time, I could probably, you know, go way out there and, you know, so I think it's good. It's good that she, you know, she says, I would say something like, well, yeah, I connected with so-and-so, you know, who passed away 10 years ago. And she'll say, okay, that's great. But, you know, I really need your help outside. We need to, you know, plant some plants. Okay. All right. And then I'll go out and do that. And so I think it's, you have to have one foot in, you know, this world and one foot in the spirit world. And that's fine. And I think that's very healthy. But yeah, you do have to, you know, you can't just meet somebody and say, oh, I can tell, you know, that you have been visited by aliens, and say they're just somebody could just say, well, I don't want to talk to this person. You have to kind of not spring it on them, kind of find out where, you know, kind of feel them out a little bit and see where things are. And that's fine. You know, and even me, sometimes I hear things and I go, oh, that can't be right. I don't think that is way too much. And then I think about it some more, and then I think about the way the universe is, and I think, well, I'm pretty open-minded, so let me do some research. And sure enough, I find out, well, maybe there is something to that. So it kind of breaks down these barriers, and I think ultimately you go back to the openness that we were as children, where we're natural scientists and explorers and experiencing, you know, we experience the world in a very different way than we do as adults, where we've learned all these barriers and that kind of thing.
So that being said, with that type of writing, you do that. So with your historical writing, was it a different kind of careful? Was it a different way in which you approached that sort of medium too? Because you do have, there's accurate text that you're trying to portray, right? So
yeah.
Were you very careful about that as well? And was it the same kind of careful, or was it different?
Well, even with the paranormal writing, I don't write about things as if I'm not sure, I will tell the reader, you know, this happened to me, but I'm not exactly sure why or if it would happen to anybody else. But this is what happened to me. This is what I think it's about. But I'm not like, preaching or something like that. You know, this is how you have to believe or whatever. And I think with history, the way I've approached history has been very much as individual history. So when I've written my history books, I like to present history from the point of view of the individual. Because I very much believe, well, for instance, like when America goes to war, America doesn't go to war, individual Americans go to war. When America has a depression, it's individual Americans who suffer an economic depression, you know, that type of thing. When there's racism in America, it's not the country that experiences racism, it's individual Americans that experience it, you know, that type of thing. And so I think that keeps it down to earth, and people identify with that. And then you can make some generalizations too, based on what is going on in the country at any given time. But yeah, you do have to use primary sources, you know, to try to back things up. But it's good sometimes to push the envelope a little bit. And I do that with my textbook because I was so tired of these, what I call corporate textbooks. They're written by teams of historians that have to come to this, you know, kind of agreement on everything. And I think they're so afraid to say something that they say really nothing. I mean, these are brilliant historians too, and these textbooks are just so watered down and so uninteresting. I don't blame the students for not wanting to read them. I don't want to read them. I had to read them because I just wanted to see what was out there, and I go, oh my gosh, no wonder my students aren't reading. There's exciting ways. You know, history's exciting. It's what all our writing is based on, is what happens to people. So no matter what type of writing you're doing. So how can we make it so uninteresting when it is fascinating? And there's things sometimes that you find out that you might have a preconceived notion of what you think the answer may be or where the truth lies. And then through your research, you find out, well, it took you in a different direction. And I think it is kind of like playwriting or fiction writing too, because sometimes you sit down and you say, okay, this is the way the story is going to go. And then you find out, then the characters take over and they say, no, that's not the way it's going. This is the way it's going to go. And then you have to change, and see where it leads you. I think that's important for historians as well as fiction writers. I haven't written a lot of fiction. I mean, other than short stories, I've only written one novel. It was for children, but still, it was interesting how the characters take over. And it's the same with a play too. I hear the character after you develop these characters, you hear them, and then they give you guidance on which way to go, and what makes sense to them. And I think that's, maybe that's the muse or your inner voice as well, but I hear them in the characters' voices in plays and in the fiction book that I wrote.
When does the story take shape for you then? Is it somewhere along the lines of the process, or does it take a couple drafts for you to find what you're actually trying to say?
Yeah, I think I have the basic inspiration. It starts with a problem usually, and I'll give you an example. My first play, I call it The Bronze Star. A friend of mine, dear friend of mine, committed suicide in 2002. And he was a Vietnam veteran. And I used to teach a Vietnam War history course. And I struggled with the way to tell his story, because then I found out, well, it wasn't just him. There's 22 veterans every day in America who commit suicide. And I thought that is something that's a story that needs to be told. So it was a problem that then became a story, and it became his story brought to the stage. So I figured that was the only way to tell this story. So I think it begins with a problem or something that you perceive as a problem, and you need to tell that story to help people see the problem in a different way and maybe help offer some solutions. So that, I think that's the way I look at it. And it's the same with my fiction book for children. It was about a young boy who's a war refugee from the Iraq War, living with his grandfather, who's a beekeeper in East Los Angeles, and they're very poor. But his grandfather keeps bees. Well, his grandfather uses the bees to teach him life lessons, and he's kind of an awkward boy, and he's trying to learn baseball. He's trying to get along, and there's a lot of Islamophobia and other problems along the way, and he learns about life from the bees. And the characters came to life for me, and it was all based on a problem that was in real life, which is the bees are dying, and this is a problem for us because 1/3 of our food is because of pollination from bees, and the other problem was the war, how it impacts children. Very few people think about how wars impact children and create refugees and orphans. And so there was some problems that I had that generated the story idea that then became these characters, and those characters help tell that story.
Something interesting that happens in your books too a lot is you incorporate drawings into them, and you have a very special person that does drawings for the Timeless series.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, Gary Dunn. He is brilliant. He's been around since the early 70s. He was part of American Splendor. He was the primary artist for Harvey Pekar, who did American Splendor, which then became a wonderful movie. I forgot what year it came out, but they won awards. And I think actor Paul Giamatti played Harvey Pekar. And Harvey Pekar had appeared on the David Letterman show, and he was hilarious. He's just a cantankerous, brilliant guy who never finished his college education, but a very brilliant guy. And had this idea of very personal type comic books, the personal struggles of everyday people, quotidian life, as he said, just everyday life. And Gary Dunn was one of the principal artists. And I love comic books, and I have since I was a kid. I'm a frustrated artist, so I've written comic books and did that comic strip. And I contacted him because of Harvey Pekar, because I was such a big fan of American Splendor. And I looked at all the comic books, and I saw Gary Dunn's art, and I said, that's the guy I want to illustrate my history anti-textbook that I call it, Making History. And I wanted comic book pages at the beginning of each chapter so students could relate to it, with the idea in mind, inspired by Harvey P. Carr, that you can do anything with words and pictures. And so I would tell a story relating to that period in American history with this one-page comic book page. And Gary Dunn did that. And then I recruited him to do Timeless, and he was nice enough to do it. And he's nice enough to do, I think I shared some of his recent illustrations for the second Timeless book. And he doesn't know it yet. Well, he probably does know it. He's going to do the third book too.
So do you value these drawings as the cherry on the sundae, or is it more of a foundation for what you're trying to do? Or is there some other way you would put it?
That's an interesting question. I think it's a companion to it. I think I can't imagine doing these Timeless books without Gary's drawings, illustrations. And, I mean, I could have done it as a graphic novel, but that is quite an undertaking. It takes a very long time. So I think the way we're doing it, where we got the stories with the one illustration, one full page illustration per, well, not per every story, but, most of them. I think that works out really well. It's kind of a nice, it's kind of old fashioned in a way. If you look at old books, like old fairy tale books and stuff, I don't know if you remember when you were little, you'd look at these fairy tale books and, the ones that were like, they were always leather bound, and you'd get them, like my parents would buy them with encyclopedias and stuff. And they wouldn't have an illustration every page. It would just be like every 10th page or every 8th page. And it was just enough to, when you're an early reader, to hook you in. It's like, oh, I love the pictures, but then I got to read the story too. So I think that's what Gary's doing. He's hooking the reader who's more visual into the story. And then the story is hooking people who are maybe more text oriented into the visual. So I think it's meeting us, halfway.
What do you think your audience has taught you that maybe you were naive to or just plain wrong about that you now apply to what you're doing these days?
I was a little bit fearful of writing Timeless, and it was Gene who pushed me into it. And I've had nothing but good. I mean, there's a crackpot here or there, but
right.
The people like the honesty of it. They like how I'm combining the chronology, my skills as a historian into my creative writing, but telling the true stories, of the paranormal in my case. And so I think they like that combination, and I think they've taught me not to be afraid. And I think they're pushing me even farther. This new Timeless book that comes out in April, Timeless Deja Vu, it goes even further. I go a little bit further out on the limb, because readers have encouraged me to do that. They've encouraged me to be fearless. I think we need to be fearless in our writing, because if we're so careful, we're doing a disservice to ourselves and our readers.
Do you think it's important at all that there's a protagonist and an antagonist in every story, even if it's a story that you're trying to be truthful about? Do you think that there's such a thing, or do you think that it's so ambiguous that it doesn't evolve like that for a nonfiction or a creative fiction nonfiction story?
I'm not sure that I'm a skilled enough writer to answer that question, but I'll give it a shot. The way I think about it, I kind of see what happens in my life as vignettes, and that there's a beginning, there's a middle, and an end. So that structure seems to follow through in my life. And I mean, some things are ongoing, but yet there is, like the academic semester, there's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end. And I think our lives are kind of like that. There's the little beginnings, middles, and ends, and then there's the big one, the beginning, middle, and end. And then, since I understand how the spirit world works, at least that's what my spirit friends tell me, that really the end is not an end. It's another beginning. And it just goes on and on. So I think it is important, and there are good guys and bad guys in the world, and then there's some that are kind of in between, the Loki types, the trickster types. So all these classic things that that Jung had talked about, these classic the characters that always take shape in every story. I think there is something to that. I think that that is true. So no matter what style you're writing, there's always going to be protagonists, antagonists, and tricksters, and they're all out there. All of us are inhabiting these roles, whether we know it or not. I think sometimes, and sometimes we can shift roles. I do like the idea of the anti-hero, the kind of flawed hero. See, I don't see myself as a hero, but I do see myself as leading a heroic life, because I always tell people that we are the heroes of our own lives. All of us are, and we're trying to be the best. I'm trying to be the best Bruce I can be, and so that is heroic. And all of us are heroes in our own way. So, I guess that's kind of a Joseph Campbell kind of way of looking at things.
I like that idea, especially with an antagonist, especially because I think an antagonist is just somebody who thinks that they're right and truthful and a hero to themselves, but their narrative is being skewed by what's around them and in the environment they're in. I think that's extremely important. That's why one of the first days in history class, I show images, and I show images of, I'll show an image of Saddam Hussein or of Osama bin Laden, and I'll say, and then an American soldier, and I'll say, okay, who's the good guy and who's the bad guy? And most people, with their gut reaction, the good guy is the American soldier, bad guy, Osama bin Laden. I say, well, does the American soldier think he's a good guy? And they go, yeah. And I said, well, do you think Osama bin Laden thought he was a good guy? And they kind of hesitate for a moment, and then they go, well, maybe he did. Well, he probably did. I'm not saying that he is a good guy, but I'm just saying that's what makes antagonists interesting, is that they have that idea that they are probably right. They think they're right, and so they're not just so two-dimensional cardboard cutout villains. They're very, very, they can be funny. They can be really funny. And I think that's helpful. So, like in the play where I had the antagonist, or the Norwegian play that I wrote with based on my parents' experience under Nazi occupation in Norway, I had a villain who was a Nazi colonel. I mean, you can't get much more villainous than that. But he had a human side to him as well. He had vulnerabilities. At one point, one of my favorite parts of the play is where he admits he likes Buster Keaton movies. Which I think is, that's kind of endearing. But then you got to think, well, this guy's a murderer too. What is some of your favorite scenes that you've written? Is there one that sticks out that you really go, oh, I really love how I wrote that scene?
Well, back to that Norwegian play, since I'm kind of thinking about it, it's a play with a female lead character, this woman named Marie, who's she's a school teacher, and she's a little bit naive. And when the Nazis come, she starts to work for this colonel because she wants to help her family. So basically the choice is the whole question in the play is, what would you do? The Nazis come in and overwhelm. Are you going to fight actively against them and risk your life and the lives of your family? Are you going to collaborate totally with them and just join their side? Or are you going to be just surviving? And she kind of chooses to survive, kind of convincing herself that she's not really working for the enemy, even though she is his secretary, that she's really a good person, but she's, working for this bad guy. But eventually so many terrible things happen that she finds her strength to finally take him on. And in the final scene, she dispatches him. She actually, has to kill him. And I think it's an important story arc, and the final scene where she leaves, she has to shoot the colonel, and then she has to go and complete her mission. She just leaves. I think departures are really in how people exit. Stories are very important, and she says something really interesting at the end. She says, it's in Norwegian, but it's alt for Norge. She says everything for Norway, which means not just, I'll give my money or I'll give my time, but you're giving your soul, because if you are killing another human being, you are giving part of your soul. Native Americans call it soul loss when they go through combat or war when Native tribes would fight each other. nobody goes through unscathed. So I like that final line, which is "Alt for Norge," everything for Norway. It means so many different things. So that's one of my favorite scenes in my plays, anyway.
So what conversely, what scenes do fans want to talk to you about mostly?
Well, it's funny, I wrote the book Allie's Bees for middle grade readers, and we did some performances of it, not the whole play, but like scenes from it. And what was fun is that I have a character in there named Lupe, who's a friend of Ali, who's the young Iraqi orphan boy. And she has her own troubles. Her father has been deported. Her mother they're threatening to deport her. And she's got 4 siblings that she takes care of and goes to school and babysits for the neighbors. And she has, very severe asthma and all that. And she's just this bubbly, wonderful character. No matter what is thrown at her, she is like dancing around and everything. And what was cool is after the play was over, these middle school and 5th, 6th graders would run up and act like the actress was like a movie, like a rock star to them. They would swarm her because they identified with that character. They just loved that character. How she wasn't Pollyannish, but she was persevering and keeping, her self, her sense of self and her upbeatness through all this adversity. And I think kids really love that. They're looking for characters like that, inspirational characters, and especially young girls. I mean, I couldn't believe it. It was like Justin Bieber had just showed up or something, but it's just this actress playing this character in this little play. So that was kind of surprising to me, but it really shows how people are in this case, young people are reacting to the writing and to the characters and how important these characters are to them.
I especially want to ask you this question because you do write nonfiction, and I'm curious about the process in that. I'm sure you write multiple drafts, no matter what it is. But how do you go from the first draft to the second draft? What is it about the first draft that you take and mold away from in the second draft, in especially in the nonfiction sense?
Yeah, the first draft is the research draft. I just dump everything in the kitchen sink into it. And it's just a mess. I mean, I would hate to show it to anybody. Nobody would make any sense of it. It makes sense to me. And then once I get it all out on the table into the light of day, as I call it, then I start moving the puzzle pieces around and to see what kind of order they need to be in. So what I'm always afraid of is that I will forget this great information or this great idea. So I just get it out into the page as quickly as possible. I had a playwriting instructor at Cal State LA, Jose Cruz Gonzalez, that told me what that is called, what he calls it is capturing butterflies. These butterflies are kind of floating away. And if you don't get them, they're going to float away and they might not ever come back. So you got to, and I don't mean like crushing them. I mean, just, gently catch them and collect them. And then so you don't forget what these ideas are, because they come from very mystical places sometimes, these ideas, and they can come at any time, so you have to be ready.
What element of do you think most affects your characters, especially characters that you interview? I would be curious to know, is it more of, do you get more of the internal struggle from them to oftentimes, or is it something external that always carries the weight of the character and describing it for an audience?
I think it's the way in which a person internally develops given external circumstances, how they change and how they evolve. And all of us are evolving all the time. So it's that interplay of the internal struggle and the external forces that are either with us or against us. And that interplay, that magical interplay, is where the crux of the story is. The Marie character, who thought in her own mind, she said, "Oh, I'm doing a good thing. I'm providing for my family, working this job, and I'm not killing anybody. I'm just writing papers for this colonel, even though he's an evil Nazi." The external starts to impact her more, like, this guy's doing a lot of terrible stuff, and I'm somewhat in my own way facilitating it. So then the internal struggle becomes so great that she has to do something to the external, which ultimately she does the ultimate, which is to dispatch this colonel at the end.
I am very disappointed. Are you ready to kill me, alright?
So you told him you found out about this? You don't understand. My family kicked me out. Take pity, please. I didn't have a choice. No, you made the wrong choice. The Norwegian people will deal with you. Go now. You old fool, I need you.
Marie, you have to run away.
Don't worry about that now.
It's worth it for all of us for you to live free.
Anders.
The king said everything for Norway.
Everything for Norway. Everything for Norway.
I am transformed. Now the war is over. Germany surrendered. My many missions were successful. I know who I am. Part Viking, part Sami.
I helped get my country back from the Nazis. And it is alive in the soil, and the rocks, the air, the trees, the animals, and the good people.
That's the end of the journal, but not the end of the story. My family lives on. I feel them, I see them, I hear them, and I even smell them. My grandparents came from dark to light. And they stood up to powerful evil and helped save their culture and way of life. Now, it's our turn. All it takes for evil to succeed in the world is for good people to do nothing. I believe that. You better believe it.
So I love, so really doing what I'm doing now, incorporating comic art with, the written word, with the paranormal, with purpose and meaning and problem solving, and from a historical chronological perspective. I'm putting together everything that interests me and that has been motivating me in my life. And I think there's really no boundaries other than ones we create for ourselves as writers. And a lot of writers, I think, get hung up on the idea, well, I have to be successful. I have to make a living. And of course we have to make a living, but you have to make sure that, like Ray Bradbury said, every day he got up and looked in the mirror and saw a happy person staring back at him, because he did exactly what he wanted to do every day. If you have that kind of dedication and drive and motivation, then you can't help but be successful. Maybe you're not going to be a billionaire, but you'll be fine and you'll be happy. And that's the most important thing.